There's a moment that almost nobody sees. Not the breakdown, not the tears, not the argument that finally pushed everything too far. It happens later, usually at night. The room is quiet. Your phone lights up with another message from the same person who slowly taught your nervous system to live in survival mode. And for a split second, your chest tightens before you even read the words. That's when it begins. Not anger, not revenge, something far more dangerous. Your body starts learning that love is unpredictable, that kindness comes with a cost, that opening your heart is no longer safe. And the terrifying part is, you don't notice it happening at first. Because empaths don't break loudly. They break in silence, in adaptation, in the slow rewriting of who they are just to survive what keeps hurting them. People think empaths are weak because they feel deeply. But what most people never understand is this. The empath's greatest strength is also the very thing that destroys them slowly. Because you don't just hear pain, you absorb it, you translate it, you carry it inside yourself as if it belongs to you. And when someone hurts you repeatedly, your mind begins doing something almost invisible. It starts building a new version of you, one that can survive the wound. The first thing that changes inside an empath is not trust, it's perception. You stop experiencing people the same way. At first, you still try to understand them. You tell yourself they're stressed, traumatized, lost, misunderstood. You become an emotional archaeologist digging through someone else's darkness, trying to find the wounded child hidden beneath their behavior. Because that's what empaths do. You see humanity in people long after they stop showing it to you. And that's why repeated hurt affects you differently than it affects everyone else. Most people respond to betrayal with distance. Empaths respond with deeper understanding, which sounds beautiful until you realize what it costs. Every time you excuse the behavior, every time you minimize your own pain, every time you say, maybe they didn't mean it like that, you teach your nervous system that your suffering is negotiable. And eventually something inside you begins splitting in two. One part of you still believes in connection, still wants softness, still wants to love openly without fear. But the other part starts watching everything. The pauses in their voice, the delayed replies, the subtle shift in energy when you walk into the room. You become hyper-aware because your body remembers what your heart keeps trying to forget. That's the hidden psychology of repeated emotional pain. The empath becomes emotionally clairvoyant, not because they want power, but because they're trying to avoid another wound. And over time, this changes the way you exist in relationships. You stop relaxing fully. Even during happy moments, there's tension underneath. A quiet anticipation, like your soul is sitting beside the exit door preparing for impact before it arrives. People around you may never notice it. You still smile, still comfort others, still say, "I'm fine," with frightening precision. But internally, your emotional world becomes exhausting, because you're constantly scanning, reading micro-expressions, interpreting tone changes, feeling emotional currents nobody else even notices. And the tragedy is, you become incredibly accurate. That's what repeated pain does to an empath. It sharpens them, not into someone cold, but into someone cautious. Someone who can sense dishonesty before words are spoken. Someone who notices emotional absence immediately. Someone who feels the shift before the abandonment happens. But here's the part nobody talks about. The more accurate you become at reading pain, the harder it becomes to experience peace. Because eventually your mind stops asking, "How do I connect?" and starts asking, "How do I protect myself?" That's the exact moment the empath begins disappearing emotionally while still physically present. You answer messages slower. You reveal less. You laugh without fully meaning it. You become selective with your warmth because you finally realize not everyone deserves access to your inner world. And strangely, people often call this changed. But they never ask what changed you. They never ask how many nights you spent fighting battles inside your own mind after forgiving things that quietly shattered you. Because repeated emotional injury does not merely hurt an empath, it restructures them. It teaches them that being emotionally available can feel like standing unarmed in the middle of a war zone. So eventually, the empath learns the most painful skill imaginable: how to emotionally leave a room before their body does. And once that begins happening, something even deeper starts unfolding inside you. There comes a phase after repeated hurt where the empath stops reacting outwardly. And to everyone else, it looks like healing. You become quieter, more composed, less emotional. You stop arguing, stop explaining, stop chasing conversations that always leave you emptier than before. People assume you finally become strong. But what they don't realize is this: sometimes silence is not peace. Sometimes silence is grief that no longer believes it will be heard. The empath reaches a point where emotional exhaustion becomes heavier than the pain itself. You grow tired of translating your heart into a language people pretend not to understand. Tired of over-explaining wounds that should have been obvious to anyone who genuinely cared. So something ancient awakens inside you. Detachment. Not coldness, not cruelty. Detachment is different. Cold people stop feeling. Empaths never stop feeling. They simply stop offering those feelings to people who treat them carelessly. And internally, this transformation is devastating. Because empaths are not built to disconnect naturally. Your spirit is wired for emotional closeness. You instinctively reach toward people, not away from them. You want to repair, understand, soothe, reconnect. So when an empath finally begins emotionally withdrawing, it usually means they crossed a pain threshold they never thought they'd reach. And the terrifying part is how invisible this process becomes. Nobody notices the exact day your heart starts closing. It happens quietly. In the moment you decide not to mention what hurt you because it won't matter anyway. In the second you fake a smile to avoid another draining conversation. In the night you stare at the ceiling realizing you feel lonelier beside someone than you do alone. That realization changes you. Because loneliness by yourself feels survivable. But loneliness inside connection, that damages something much deeper. It creates emotional starvation. And emotional starvation is strange. The empath still gives love, still supports others, still shows kindness, but internally, they begin running on empty. Like a candle using its own wax faster than it can replenish itself. You become emotionally dehydrated, and eventually your mind does something extraordinary to protect you. It numbs selectively. Not completely, just enough to survive. You still care about people, but now there's hesitation before vulnerability, a pause before trust, a wall behind your warmth. You start measuring emotional risk without even realizing it. How long until they disappoint me? How much of myself should I reveal? Will this kindness eventually be used against me? And what's heartbreaking is that these thoughts often appear in the minds of the people who once loved most freely. That's what repeated emotional betrayal does to an empath. It turns openness into calculation, not because you became manipulative, but because your nervous system became terrified of exposure. You learn to read danger inside affection. A delayed response suddenly feels loaded with meaning. A change in tone feels like abandonment approaching. Distance feels catastrophic because your body remembers every previous moment love slowly disappeared without warning. So your inner world becomes a battlefield between intuition and fear. And eventually, even genuine love becomes difficult to trust. That's the hidden cost nobody sees. The empath doesn't just lose trust in others, they begin losing trust in themselves. You start questioning your own perceptions. Am I overreacting? Am I imagining this? Maybe I'm too sensitive. But sensitivity was never the problem. The real problem was being surrounded by people who benefited from you doubting your own emotional reality. And once an empath begins disconnecting from their own instincts, something dangerous happens. They become easier to control. Because a person disconnected from their inner truth will tolerate almost anything just to avoid feeling difficult or too emotional. So the empath starts shrinking. Not physically, spiritually. You become smaller inside yourself. You speak less honestly, need less publicly, feel more privately. Until one day you realize you've mastered the art of appearing emotionally okay while internally carrying oceans nobody can see. And this is where the transformation becomes irreversible. Because eventually the empath discovers a painful truth. The heart cannot survive forever in environments where it is repeatedly misunderstood. At some point, it adapts. And the adaptation is never random. It begins creating a version of you that no longer reaches for people first. A version that watches carefully before opening the door. A version that craves solitude because solitude feels safer than inconsistency. A version that no longer fears being alone, but starts fearing what happens to them around the wrong people. And once an empath reaches that stage, their love begins changing into something almost unrecognizable. The most dangerous stage is not when the empath cries, it's when they stop. Not because the pain disappeared, not because forgiveness finally arrived, but because something inside them has gone emotionally still. Like a forest after a fire. No screaming, no chaos, just silence, and ash where life used to be. This is the stage people misunderstand the most, because from the outside, the empath suddenly looks untouchable, calm, independent, detached from drama. They stop begging for clarity, stop seeking reassurance, stop fighting to hold together connections that keep cutting into them. And people mistake this emotional distance for healing. But internally, something much more complicated is happening. The empath is learning how to survive without emotional reciprocity, and that changes the architecture of the soul. You begin depending on yourself in ways that feel both empowering and deeply heartbreaking. You stop expecting comfort because experience taught you comfort is temporary. You stop reaching for people during emotional storms because somewhere along the way, vulnerability became associated with disappointment. So you carry everything alone, quietly. You become the person who says, "I got it. I'm okay. Don't worry about me." Even when your inner world feels like it's collapsing in slow motion. And here's the terrifying part. The more pain an empath survives alone, the less they believe they need anyone at all. That sounds like strength. But sometimes it's trauma disguised as self-sufficiency. Because humans are not meant to emotionally exile themselves, especially empaths. Your nature was never designed for emotional isolation. You were built for resonance, for depth, for mutual understanding. But repeated hurt teaches you a different lesson. It teaches you that needing people is dangerous. So the empath begins turning inward. You create private emotional worlds nobody else can access. You think deeply but speak less. Feel intensely but reveal selectively. You become emotionally fluent in silence. And eventually, you start disappearing even from the people who think they know you best. Not maliciously, protectively. Because every wound taught you that exposure comes with consequences. So now when someone asks, "What's wrong?" you instinctively say, "Nothing." Not because nothing hurts, but because explaining your pain feels more exhausting than carrying it. That's the paradox of the wounded empath. The deeper the pain becomes, the harder it is to express. Your emotions stop feeling verbal. They become atmospheric. A heaviness in your chest, mental exhaustion that sleep cannot fix, an ache when certain songs play, a strange emptiness after social interaction, even with people you care about. And slowly, your relationship with love itself begins changing. You stop romanticizing connection. You start observing it. You notice how quickly people consume emotional energy without replenishing it. How some individuals only approach you when they need healing, reassurance, validation, comfort. And because empaths naturally give, you spent years believing love meant self-sacrifice. Until eventually your soul becomes too tired to keep bleeding for temporary people. That's when the empath develops emotional boundaries so strong they almost resemble emotional walls. And this is where others become confused. Because the same person who once overflowed with warmth now hesitates before opening up. The same person who once gave endless chances now quietly walks away after a single act of disrespect. People call you colder. But cold isn't the right word. You simply learned that unrestricted access to your heart comes at a devastating cost. So now you observe more than you speak. You test consistency quietly. You trust actions over words. You notice patterns immediately. And what's fascinating is that repeated emotional pain often turns empaths into human lie detectors. Not because they became cynical, but because survival sharpened their perception. You can hear emotional incongruence in someone's voice, feel resentment hidden beneath politeness, sense emotional withdrawal long before it becomes visible. Your nervous system becomes hyper-attuned to instability because instability once wounded you deeply. But this heightened awareness comes with a price. You stop experiencing relationships innocently. Part of you is always preparing for loss. Even during beautiful moments, there's a quiet voice in the background whispering, "Don't get too comfortable. Don't trust this completely. Watch for the shift." And that voice changes everything. Because eventually the empath no longer fears abandonment itself. They fear what abandonment awakens inside them. The overthinking, the emotional spiral, the self-blame, the exhausting attempt to understand why someone who claimed to care could still cause so much damage. So instead of risking that pain again, the empath begins mastering emotional distance before anyone has the chance to hurt them deeply. And the saddest part? Most people never realize the empath didn't become less loving. They became more careful about where their love goes. But beneath all the caution, beneath the silence, beneath the walls and restraint, there is still a part of the empath secretly wondering one impossible thing. What would happen if someone finally loved me gently enough that I no longer felt the need to protect myself? And this is the final transformation nobody talks about. Not the breaking, not the silence, not even the detachment, but the moment the empath finally understands their pain was never coming from feeling too much. It was coming from feeling deeply in places that only knew how to take. That realization changes everything. Because for most of your life, you probably believed your sensitivity was the burden. You blamed your heart for being affected so easily. You called yourself emotional, overreactive, too intense, too caring. But repeated hurt eventually forces the empath into a terrifying kind of clarity. You begin seeing the difference between love and emotional consumption. And once you see it, you can never unsee it again. You realize some people were never drawn to your soul. They were drawn to your availability, your patience, your ability to absorb pain without immediately leaving. They loved the shelter you provided, while slowly becoming the storm that exhausted you. And that truth can feel almost unbearable at first. Because empaths don't just grieve relationships, they grieve potential. You mourn the version of the connection you kept trying to save inside your mind. The future you imagined. The softness you hoped would eventually return. The effort you poured into keeping something alive long after it started poisoning you emotionally. That's why empaths stay longer than most people. Not because they are weak, but because they can see beauty even inside broken things. The problem is, eventually they forget they are one of those beautiful things too. So they pour love outward while internally starving themselves, until one day the soul reaches its limit. And when that limit arrives, the empath doesn't explode. They awaken. Quietly. You stop chasing closure from people incapable of giving it. You stop shrinking yourself to keep others comfortable. You stop translating your worth through someone else's ability to recognize it. And internally, something profound begins happening. The empath starts returning home to themselves. At first it feels unfamiliar. You sit alone without needing distraction. You begin enjoying your own energy again. You notice how peaceful life becomes when you're no longer carrying emotional chaos that never belonged to you. And for the first time in a very long time, your nervous system starts unclenching. Not fully, not instantly, but slowly. Like a frightened animal learning it no longer has to hide from every sound. That's the hidden miracle after repeated pain. If the empath survives it without becoming bitter, they become extraordinarily aware. Aware of energy, aware of manipulation, aware of inconsistency, aware of the difference between being loved and merely being used for emotional comfort. And this awareness creates a new kind of presence, a quieter presence. You no longer beg to be understood, no longer perform emotional labor for people unwilling to meet you halfway, no longer confuse chaos with passion or inconsistency with depth, because the wounded empath eventually learns one life-altering truth. Real love does not require you to abandon yourself to keep it alive. And once that truth settles into your bones, your entire relationship with people changes. You become harder to deceive, harder to emotionally drain, harder to keep in one-sided relationships. Not because your heart closed, but because your heart finally learned discernment. And strangely, this is often the moment people from your past suddenly feel your absence the most. When you stop overgiving, when you stop rescuing, when you stop emotionally chasing people who only valued your presence once it was disappearing. Because empaths carry a warmth many people don't appreciate until it's gone. A kind of emotional gravity. The ability to make others feel seen, safe, understood. And when that energy withdraws, the silence it leaves behind becomes impossible to ignore. But by then, something inside the empath has already changed permanently. You no longer crave intensity, you crave peace. You crave honesty that doesn't need decoding, connection that doesn't feel confusing, love that doesn't leave your nervous system exhausted afterward. And perhaps the most beautiful part of all this is that the empath finally stops asking, "How can I save this relationship?" and starts asking, "What kind of relationship saves me too?" That question becomes the beginning of an entirely different life. A life where your sensitivity is no longer treated like a weakness. A life where your intuition is trusted instead of silenced. A life where you no longer hand your heart to people determined to mishandle it. Because after enough pain, after enough nights questioning your worth, after enough emotional survival, the empath eventually understands something almost sacred. Your softness was never the problem. Offering it to people who only knew how to bruise it was.